Hello, everyone. This is criminal profiler Pat Brown. And anybody who knows anything in Australia and in Melbourne, they are very excited this week because there was a break in an almost half a century old case. And this is the Easey Street murder case with these two beautiful young women. That's Suzanne Armstrong here and Susan Bartlett. They were brutally stabbed to death. Dozens and dozens and dozens. Like I think it was up toward 80 stab wounds combined with these two ladies. The little baby here, he survived in his crib, but the two women were brutally murdered, and there was also a post-mortem rape of Suzanne, and a shocking murder, something that nobody could even fathom, and it went unsolved for such a long time. Now, I did a show on this, an analysis on this case, and so I'm going to link that below. So it's a 2-hour show going through all the details of the case, how a profiler would look at this case with the information I had. And I always point out, I'm outside the case. I don't have the police files because I did not work this case. So only what is publicly released can I go on. But I'm trying to show how a profiler would look at a case, how a detective would look at a case with what evidence they had, and looking at the whole, how the murder went down, who had access, what were the behaviors at the scene, what is the forensic evidence, all this stuff put together. Who would be most likely to have done this? And it's a very tricky case because in my analysis, I came up with a top suspect. If I had to pick a suspect, there were 8 main suspects that they had looked at. I thought 7 of them didn't impress me, didn't make sense to me, but there was one that did. And this was a guy, in my video, I call him Creepy Guy because I didn't know his name at the time. And he was stalking Susan. He was quite obsessed with her. And after this is a story he gives. After the murders went down, he hadn't known the murders went down. She had given him a phone number and he wasn't being answered. So he wondered whether it was really her phone number. So he went to where she lived, which is kind of odd because he knows where she lives. So what's your problem? Knock on the door, maybe? Instead, he goes around the alley and climbs in her bedroom window, leaving a footprint on her bed. And then they're dead, by the way. The two ladies are dead in the house, brutally murdered. Suzanne is in her bedroom. She's in the hallway. But the guy goes theoretically the other direction and doesn't see down the dark hallway, goes to the living room area, and he checks the phone, like the little number, you used to have those little circular things on the phone. You could look at the number on it to see if it was the right phone number. And then he goes back out the window. Now, that's a pretty strange story. The guy's a stalker and a creepy stalker. And he was in the house. He goes to the police and admits he was there. Oh, that's my footprint on the bed. So of the 8 suspects at the time, what I said was, this is one guy whose story, it's not real credible. I don't really believe he just went in to look at the phone. I don't know what he was doing there, but the question was did he realize he left some evidence there? And that's why he went to the police to tell them, oh yeah, I went in later. I wasn't there at the time, but I went in to check this phone. Was there some crazy excuse? Well, he was one of the 8. And I said, if I had to pick a top suspect at that point in time with what I know, this would be the guy I'd pick. Interestingly enough, when they finally did get some DNA back, none of the 8 matched, including my creepy guy. And I'm like, okay, it's not him. Theoretically, and I said, if the DNA is any good, because sometimes DNA can be messed up, mishandled. It can be a combination of more than one DNA. So maybe he's still in play, but according to what they say, none of these 8 were a DNA match to semen DNA. So that's pretty good stuff. We're not talking about some touch DNA where somebody could have dropped a package off and their touch DNA is in the house. So we're talking semen DNA. So they're very likely the guy who did it, especially since there was a postmortem rape, and that's where the DNA was at. All right, so then I said in my video, if you go and watch it, and I do want you to watch it to understand the just the whole breakdown of the crime. But here I'm just going to give you the basics of what I said then, which is, if it isn't one of these 8 guys, you never know. And this was before I knew anything about this. I said, hopefully they will come up at some point with a familial DNA thing. They'll somehow find this guy. And when they do, and they say, this is the guy, we'll go, who the hell was he? Because we'll never have heard about him. And pretty much that's what happened. So this is the guy that now is supposedly a DNA match to the semen left at the scene. This guy. Now, who is this guy? Well, he's 65 years old now. His name is Perry Kouroumblis. He was a Greek Australian, and he lived quite near their location, so very near. And when they came to talk to him, as they did with many people, about, hey, we would like to get your DNA, he said something like, sure, and then he left the country and went to Greece. Okay, which is good for him in the sense that you can't extradite somebody out of Greece. If he were guilty of this crime, after 20 years has passed, you can't extradite somebody out of Greece. And this was already, many years past 20. So he was safe in Greece, even if he was the killer. So there he was in Greece. Did that mean he did it? It hasn't been proven yet, except the DNA is pretty compelling. But I'm sitting there thinking, who the hell is this guy? Who is he? Because I never read anything about this guy. Turns out the police did know about him. So it wasn't a complete just lucky hit. Sometimes when you do like familial DNA, it'll be narrowed down to some guy, and you're like, oh, that guy who is that guy? They never even thought about that person at the time. They never knew that guy existed at the time, but he turns out to be a construction worker or something down the block, and the police never even knew the guy existed. But in this case, they actually did know this guy existed. He actually was stopped. His vehicle was stopped 2 weeks after the murder. And he had a knife in the boot. And on that knife, there was type A blood that was the same type as Suzanne's and had been cleaned off. Fairly new knife. They asked him about the knife, and he said, oh, I found it on the railroad tracks. Well, that's a good story. He was 17 years old, going on 18, but 17. And then he had an alibi. That this is what I'm reading in the media at the moment. He has an alibi. A good alibi. Well, the good alibi, this gets where it gets really shady. The good alibi is supposedly a couple of friends of his that the 3 of them were burglarizing places at the time. He didn't have time to murder the 2 women because he was too busy burglaring other residences. All right. I don't know how good an alibi that is. When your buddies give you an alibi, that's not a good alibi. And if the police accepted that as something to take them off the suspect list, then they failed in their job. There's only a few alibis that you can say are absolute. For example, there was a case where a fellow, they did DNA on a guy dead in the park, and it matched this homeless guy. Poor homeless guy, It's like, oh God, he did it because he was in that area, right? But it turned out that the homeless guy was in the ICU at the time the guy was murdered. And what happened was it was touch DNA, and the touch DNA had been transferred from medical equipment that was in the ambulance from the homeless guy to the dead guy. And that's how the homeless guy's DNA got on the dead guy. Well, thank God for poor homeless guy that he was in the ICU, or he might have gone down. So if you're in the ICU at the time, if you're in prison at the time, in jail at the time, if you're not even in the country at the time, if you are a preacher and you're in the pulpit and you're in front of a crowd of 500 of your flock, and so you have 500 witnesses at that time, you had an alibi. Those are good alibis. Video of you someplace where you clearly were out of town and you were you were at an ATM with your card and it's you. Yeah, that works. Your wife? No. The girlfriend? No. The mother? No. Your brother? No. And your buddies? No. Those all suck as alibis because they'll lie for you. So supposedly, 2 weeks after the crime, you got a guy here who's a burglar, who has A knife they theorized may well be the knife that, I don't know, they proved it, but it had her, same blood type. You have a burglar with a knife that they think might be the knife that was used in the crime, and his only alibi are some criminal buddies, and he lives close by the crime scene. That guy should never have been off the suspect list. And I don't know, I'll say this to be fair to law enforcement. This is what the media says again. I don't know if law enforcement always had their eye on him, but just couldn't do much about it. Now, with the other 8 suspects, prior to anybody being eliminated by DNA, if you compare him at 17 years old to Creepy Guy is a way better suspect. Creepy Guy was in the house. Creepy Guy was a stalker. This guy was maybe a local juvenile delinquent, but that doesn't necessarily mean he was anywhere near the house or in the house. He's only 17. So the police pretty much, according to the media, put him way down on the suspect list or tossed him off. I don't know which one, because he was so young and he didn't know the 2 ladies. And it almost looked like maybe they let the guy in. And that was one of the theories they had, that they opened the door to the killer. I don't necessarily think that's true, but I see why the police might have believed that. So he was probably, they looked at him. I don't know how hard they looked at him. I don't know if they could have looked at him way harder and solved this crime right away. It was 1977, maybe 1978, they could have solved this crime. But because they didn't push hard enough with bringing in the friends and interrogating or whatever else they needed to do, they missed out on getting evidence and enough to put him away, if he is indeed the guy who committed this crime. But I wasn't there. I don't know. They may have done what they, when you're in the midst of these kind of investigations, you have way better suspects in this guy. You might be over-focused on, like the Creepy Guy. I mean, I really can focus in on him because he was just, something was off with that guy for sure. And his story was crazy, but he did have a knife. So, you try to balance that out. Creepy Guy and his what seems like a bogus story, and he was in the actual house, left his evidence he was in the house. This guy who has no evidence he was in the house and said he simply found a knife by the railroad tracks. Is that possible? Well, sure. He's a juvenile. He's walking down the railroad tracks, which, teens love to do, right? And he sees a knife and he's like, oh man, cool, nice new knife, and takes it. That's not an unreasonable story. The police believe that the killer would have gotten rid of the knife. So they were more likely to believe the killer threw the knife on the railroad tracks and he picked it up just because he wanted, it was cool, a nice knife, rather than he was the killer and he kept the knife in his car. So that was their theory. And unfortunately, they didn't look at him enough or couldn't come up with enough evidence to pin it on him. Or I won't say pin, evidence to eventually arrest and get a conviction. But they knew he existed. And I didn't know that they knew this guy existed at all, but they did. And somewhere along the way, when they went to ask him for DNA, he said, sure, and then got the heck out of Dodge, and off he goes to Greece, where he can be hiding and not have to worry about being extradited. However, they just waited. They were very patient. They waited. He went onto an Interpol list, and 6 years later, he decided, for whatever reasons, he needed a vacation, and he went off to Italy, and they grabbed him in the Rome airport. So that's pretty amazing. So there's still a big ordeal of whether they can get him back to Australia at all. He's 65. Will it be till he's 70 before they can get him out? Will they ever get him out? And one thing that's always very frustrating is that when you don't catch somebody right away, that means he got to live out the rest of his life having a perfectly fine time. These 2 women didn't have any lives at all. He had a great time. This little boy lost his mother. So when you don't catch somebody quickly, you really don't get justice. You might get answers, but justice is kind of, I think, yeah, it's nice to know who did it, but that's not real justice, to catch somebody when they're 65 and then you just, give them a assisted living facility with some bars in it. That's not really a penalty, shall we say. But and also during those years, a guy like this who would brutally kill two women and commit a post-mortem rape, that is a psychopath and that is a serial killer. I find it extremely hard to believe that he went for the next 40 years and never harmed anybody ever again. I mean, he did this crime and got away with it. Why wouldn't he commit more crimes? So I'm sure they will be looking to see wherever he lived, were there other women who got murdered that were never attributed to him. And he actually is a bona fide serial killer. And in my opinion, he is a serial killer. Whether we can ever figure out who he killed, who else he killed, anybody who'll cross the line to do this is a serial killer. He enjoyed what he did. And how he, at 17 years old, going on 18, one of the questions I think the police had was that the guy who stabbed somebody, these two women, almost 80 times, or I can't remember the exact number, and brutally, there was blood everywhere. It's like, it's everywhere. It's got to be on him. Now, there was evidence they washed the knife off in the sink. Could he have gone in the shower and washed and cleaned himself completely off before he left the premises? Yes. There was a lady down the street, and I discount a lot of what I didn't like her witness statement. I really didn't, because she said that she looked over. It was a hot night. She's sitting outside and she looked over and she saw a guy having drinks with her, like a little shot glasses. And then later on, she saw that same guy washing out a bloody cloth at the kitchen sink. And then she saw that guy going down the alley with a knife. Well, that's a pretty strange story because she didn't call the police. So you see this guy in her house and they're together, and then you see the guy washing blood out of a rag and running away with a knife. You'd think you call the police, at least go over and knock on the door and see if the girls are all right. She didn't do that. She didn't bother until the police, a few days later, she told the story to the police. They didn't really find it very credible. Now, it's possible it was credible, but she's just such a horrible person that she didn't bother to report it to the police, because she could have saved these women's lives. Assuming that they'd only been stabbed once or twice, she might have saved somebody's life. Maybe this little boy who was getting dehydrated in the crib for a few days, the police could have gone in there and they could have taken that little boy out of there. He could have died because she didn't report to the police. So I don't know that I believe her story. Could it have been true? Possibly, but it was odd. It was an odd story and didn't make a whole lot of sense. But you wonder if this guy was only 17. And he committed a crime this vicious at 17. This is pretty astronomical as far as viciousness goes. We're not talking about one woman. We're talking about two, and we're talking about not one or two stabs or a gunshot. Or we're talking about this guy went to town on them and just brutalized them, and then committed a sexual act after the death of Suzanne on a dead woman's body. That's not exactly normal, shall we say. So he's clearly a psychopath. Burglars, by the way, are also sometimes serial killers. Serial killers are sometimes burglars. So because they like going into somebody else's territory. So that a burglar is a serial killer is not surprising to me. But that he was able to, he did leave DNA, because back then, nobody thought about DNA. They didn't exist. So you didn't have to worry about, I should wear a condom. I should, wash up. I should do all these things. You didn't worry about it. So that's why some of these cold cases aren't getting solved by any kind of brilliant work, but by the fact that somebody actually had the brains to save the evidence and preserve it well enough to get DNA that many years later, when DNA became a real thing, when DNA was, you were able to do testing on DNA in very small quantities rather than having to have a large amount. So DNA has changed the world of cold cases, where most of the time cold cases used to not be solved because by the time maybe you knew who did it, but you couldn't take it to court because you just didn't have solid evidence. You had theories, but no evidence. DNA gives you evidence. Evidence is really hard to deny. How he would get out of saying, why is his semen on her? If he didn't even know her. I say it's not like Touch DNA where he dropped a package off at her house, or he came and he cleaned her house. It was a janitorial service, cleaned the house up, touched different things, touched a window, and left a fingerprint. No, we're talking about semen DNA. It's kind of hard to explain. Now, sometimes semen DNA can be left at a murder scene, not from the killer, because the woman had sex with somebody prior to the murder. And that murderer didn't leave semen DNA, but the guy who had sex with her prior did, and he isn't coming forward to tell the police it's his. Oh yeah, that's mine. No, I'm just going to keep quiet. And those were in the days where, as long as your DNA wasn't in a data bank, and then nobody would ever connect that DNA to you. Except now we got familial DNA, which is doing a lot of people in. So we see all these gains in DNA analysis, and the familials really come in very handy. So sometimes when somebody's DNA shows up someplace, the question is, how did it get there? It has to be a logical reason why it would be there in order to take them to court and say there's no question this was the person who did it. And so he had the knife that is suspected to be used in that murder, and now his semen is there too. If he comes back to Australia, he'll go down. It's pretty good. It's pretty solid evidence. And but a 17-year-old psychopath of that kind, it's kind of I don't see that often. I see 17-year-olds kill people. That's no question about that. They'll do that. There are 17-year-old rapists and murderers, no question. There are 17-year-old serial killers, but the amount of violence in this crime was so extreme, and the ability after that extreme violence to then wash up and walk away. It's quite interesting for a person that young. I would have expected that person to be older. Okay, I would expect them to be older, just because you would think they had maybe a couple of sexual homicides under their belt and had learned a few things and knew what to do and were confident. If this was a first, wow, it would be an anomaly. And I want to mention, this is my last thing for this case. I want to talk about anomalies. Oftentimes when you have a case, it's very bizarre, and you can analyze it really, really well. The detectives could analyzed it well. I thought I analyzed it well. But when you have a real anomaly, well, then you're all surprised. You go, well, didn't see that coming. Because when you're looking at crime scene stuff, there's no absoluteness when you're analyzing stuff. What you're doing is coming up with a theory that hopefully at the time will help you pick the best avenue of investigation. Had I known about this guy at the time, I would have had 2 avenues of investigation. I didn't like the other 7 suspects at all for this crime. I like creepy guy very much. He would have been my top suspect. So I would have said, you really want to work on this guy. But on the other hand, even though he's quite young, but he's got maybe has the knife. And yeah, it's weird that he would have kept it, but also, but maybe he had something to do with it. I know he could have just picked up on the tracks and just been that kind of guy, and other people said he was with him, but I would keep my eye on that guy. So I would have 2 suspects. I would say my creepy guy would have been my 80%, and this guy would have been 20. But the point being that all you can do is analyze as well as you can, and then go down the avenues, and just don't get total tunnel vision where you go, oh, it's got to be this guy. Let's just ignore that. Even when there's some interesting information that you go, maybe we shouldn't just toss him off the person of interest list. Maybe we should keep him there. And I don't know what happened back in the day, but things have changed DNA-wise, and they have arrested him. And it'll be interesting to see if they can get him out of Italy and get him back to Australia. I'd like to know more about what happened back then as far as him, his alibi, and so on and so forth. I want to know what other crimes he committed. I'd like them to see if he committed crimes in Greece, because he may have continued his serial homicide career in Greece or in other areas of Australia, or even in Melbourne. I don't know. They're probably going to look through all their unsolved cases and see who this guy might match. It's a very, very interesting case. Fascinating. Again, check the link below if you're interested in the how to analyze cases. This is what I do for my channel. It's an educational channel where I go through the process of analyzing. And I'm not trying to solve the case. I'm just trying to show how I would analyze a case and how detectives would analyze a case. And if you're a detective in training or want to become a detective, this is what my channel is also good for, that you can get experience understanding how to analyze evidence and how to profile a crime. So I hope you got something out of this. Looking forward to seeing what comes of this this arrest, and well, I'm sure we're going to learn more as time goes on. But yes, I am glad that it's quite amazing that this DNA did finally bring closure to this case, if not real justice, at least an answer. So anyway, thank you for being here. And if you're new to the channel, please do like and subscribe and check out my playlist for all the other cases that I analyze. And I do have other Australian cases as well. So check those out if you're from Australia. Thank you for being here. Bye-bye.